I kind of believe that we collectively create ground state reality. What the majority of us believe at any given time in history tends to be the reality that we see.
In an ideal world, we would have kind of used our computers to kind of store all the extra stuff, but also kind of kept our own memory muscles pumping as well. So there's a worry that, for example, things like Grammarly, as they get really, really good, I think people just won't bother learning.
Writing has never been more important, in my opinion, because we're still very text-based.
There's a human tendency towards slippery slopes. I think that every degree is an English degree. It's kind of matter about how well you can express yourself and write clearly and communicate well. Read a chapter of something and write down what you think and show it to somebody.
Well, hello everyone, it's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. They told me that I would get bored and stop doing this after maybe 6 episodes. Dylan, what episode is this? I don't even know. It's like 170. My guest today is Dylan O'Sullivan. Yes, of course, I'm motivated reasoning here. I like the Irish, so kill me. Actually, Dylan is an amazingly talented writer who came to us through Rite of Passage. Dylan, welcome.
Pleasure to be here, Jim. Is this the battle of the O apostrophes today?
I think it is. In America, there are a lot more Shaughnessy's than O'Shaughnessy's, right? Because when they got to Ellis Island, they were like, "What's your name?" And they'd say, O'Shaughnessy. And they'd go, yeah, no, that isn't your name. What's your name? And that's how we got it bastardized down to, I shouldn't say bastardized, to Shaughnessy. But isn't the O, doesn't that signify of the Shaughnessy clan? Isn't that what that is?
Yeah, I think so. No, I'm going to be totally honest. My Irish has been and continues to be awful. So I think so. But there's a similar phenomenon between Ireland and Britain where a lot of the O's got lost. They call it taking the soup. I don't know how apocryphal it is, but it was kind of during the famine. If you kind of wanted to get your dinner at the end of the day, you lost the O to kind of embrace your Britishness. Now, I don't know if that's a wives' tale, but there's a case of a lot of O's being lost as well in Ireland and Britain around that time.
I am reading right now Sebastian Barry's new book. Are you a fan of Sebastian Barry?
Can't say I am. No, he's a new name for me.
I think I've just I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship, my friend. I think you're going to love his work. He is one of my favorite literary authors. He's Irish. And just go to the catalog. You will. He is literally a poet writing in prose.
That's how I liked him.
You'll love him. And what he's talking about now is kind of the dark side of Ireland's history. Not so much back when the Brits were trying to fuck with the Irish, but the whole scandals with the clergy, the troubles, etc. And it's told by an unreliable narrator who's a retired cop. And it's just brilliant. I highly, highly recommend it. But let's get on to your stuff. We found you through Rite of Passage, and give me your origin story here, Dylan, because you have a very fancy degree, which I am very enamored of, but you're going in a different direction. So tell us all about it.
Slightly, yeah. So we'll start from the very start, I suppose. So kind of an unorthodox beginning. I was homeschooled until the age of 11. My mom kind of trained as a primary school teacher, but she decided to teach me and my sister at home, taking education into her own hands. So I was like, hyper creative, kind of quote unquote free range. So that's kind of stood to me in a big sense going forward. So then kind of moved into the system then from the age of 12 to 18, and kind of didn't necessarily align too well at points, but kind of put my head down and copped on near the end, because I kind of said, I was kind of misbehaving until like a second last year equivalent of high school. And then I said, what, next year kind of defines where I get to go after this. So it's kind of like in my own interest to kind of put my head down and start doing my homework. So yeah, then onto the fancy degree up to Trinity, which I get no end of abuse for abandoning Cork and going up to Dublin to study English, especially of all things. So it's like, useless degree possible. So, but to be fair, I kind of found it that way a little bit. Again, that's kind of when I started to kind of be from 0 to 11, that it kind of age profile of my life kind of reappeared, and I kind of decided to take things into my own hands again, which kind of took the form of, listening to lectures on YouTube while my actual lectures were going on in like the neighboring hall, and do my own reading list, my own curricula, turning up rarely, very, very, like I kind of, how it worked was there was like a 12-week module for each semester. So I would identify which module I wanted, or which week was covering the subject that I wanted to do my final essay on. So then I would just attend 1 out of 12 weeks and just attend that week, get the lowdown, and then just do the final essay on that. And in week 12, because it was like no exams as such, it was all essays. So I kind of figured that out just so I could work away myself. Basically, in the meantime, I do my own stuff and not have to kind of abide by that curricula. Then took a year out to kind of save up for a master's, because there isn't necessarily the straightest road out of an English studies degree into the world of employment unless you kind of want to carry on the academic path. And then I kind of see which way the winds were going. I thought, okay, new media is kind of the place to go. And then kind of looked up where's the best new media degree in the world. It turned out to be Amsterdam, which turned out to be also one of the cheapest. So it was like perfect symmetry in that respect. And then, did 2 years there. Kind of slightly hampered by the pandemic. So I did year 1 via Cork on Zoom. But then for year 2, I got to go out there, thank God. And then basically, I think I was still talking. Literally just after I handed in my thesis, that's kind of when the rite of passage and my Jim O'Shaughnessy arc began. So it's kind of, everything kind of lined up in a very, very strange way, and there was kind of no gaps.
I love it. Let's go back to Trinity, and for our American and other listeners, Trinity is kind of the Ivy League of Ireland, and I find it really fascinating because it's actually why I think we fit so well together. Our thesis is that the old institutions are collapsing in many ways. And I find it absolutely fascinating that you get into Trinity, like getting into Harvard or Yale here, and you're watching YouTube lectures. What was the disconnect? Why were the lectures at Trinity so off-putting for you?
It was, I kind of don't like bad-mouthing it, because I really liked all the staff, and I liked, like, the lectures are kind of interesting, but it was kind of, it felt like it had reached like the final boss of like minutiae that they were focusing on. It was kind of these really weird, narrow, specialized channels of research that not really applicable to the outside world. It seemed like, it was kind of what they happened to be focusing on as part of their research, or as part of their, like, as part of what they just happened to be interested in that week. So there's kind of all these kind of grander kind of questions of writing and the humanities proper and the classics and stuff were kind of slightly glossed over, kind of nodded at, before they kind of got on to whatever they wanted to talk about particularly. So, and again, it was kind of like, obviously academic writing is a huge part of, it's kind of like I think that every degree is an English degree at root, except like, the kind of mathematics ones, because it's kind of a matter of how well you can express yourself and write clearly and communicate well. That'll kind of get you to the door in most exams and essays. And that was kind of just taken for granted coming in. Kind of teaching you how to write an academic essay or how to structure one. So it's kind of, everyone was kind of writing badly on topics that weren't necessarily the most enticing. So like, this isn't going to, I can game the system now and play the game here, and it'll serve me well, but I don't think I'm going to learn anything that's applicable post graduation. And it was very, closed system.
So That's a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just in Ireland, right?
Yeah.
A lot of these departments, and not just English, by the way. It's not just the humanities.
No.
It seemed to have kind of spun up these closed systems where, it's kind of like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin arguments, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And it seems to me that that's tragic in so many ways, because the essence of an education is to help all of us, right? Think more clearly, act more clearly, synthesize ideas better, and having these systems, again, let's underline, not just Trinity, this is everywhere.
It's everywhere.
That are closed off presents this huge opportunity for things like Essayful, excuse me. Talk about that a bit, because I think it's a fabulous project that you're doing, and like, what an undertaking.
Yeah, and what it is, it isn't such an undertaking from my perspective, because it's been so long in the making. Because it kind of began around that time when I started, started with top 10 books to read on how to write, for example, or top 10 books about the classicism or aesthetics and stuff like that. And I started kind of building up folders and folders of books and notes and quotes, and basically kind of developing my own curricula from the ground up. That kind of, it quickly grew into something that would take a couple of lifetimes or some miraculous technological quantum leaps forward to actually be able to read it in one lifetime. But all of this stuff, but I was reading, I think it was 3 books. I think it's dropped now. I was doing the math. So it's gone out to 2.5, but it was 3 books a week reading for, I think, 8 years. Kind of on my phone, hardback on my computer, and in the dentist, on the bus, just kind of squeezing in as much as I could. So then just, again, backing up all of that into kind of a mega file as well on my computer. So every quote is easily searchable and indexable on my laptop, which I'm kind of, my brain doesn't die because I need to back it up. So yeah, it's been 8 years of just that process. So, and then it's been all sitting on my computer. So I thought, okay, maybe it's time to start, dressing this up and make it some public facing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's what that's the Essayful thing. Yeah.
So, tell me, after reading all this, what were your biggest takeaways? What surprised you? What, at the end or even in the middle, was there a moment when you synthesized one view with another that led to a completely new thought? Take us through, what if you were going to sit somebody down and give them a 10-minute summary, if you will, to get them interested, right? To get them to say, wow, I think maybe I want to go read those. What give it to me, frame it for me.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. The first thing I would say is that just that, I don't know, the Heraclitus or whatever, there's nothing new under the sun, that old kind of adage. And then kind of almost from that kind of hustle, quote unquote, writing hack culture. I was kind of so how do the best do these things? And then I kind of found out that, people used to, I think it was Joan Didion, just used to type out Hemingway novels word by word just to kind of get the feel.
Hunter S. Thompson did that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So this kind of idea that, mimicry isn't bad. And that's kind of these kind of iterative processes are what kind of lend you a style and a voice in the first place. You kind of have to put in this initial work of it's the classic apprenticeship. And I think there's a misconception with writing that you're so special, your voice is magical from birth. You don't need to practice, you're beautiful, it's fine, don't worry about it. But that's none of the masters kind of followed that kind of advice. And you look at what Shakespeare did, and I touched on that in the most recent essay, where they would just read the classics and they would literally try and synthesize, take out the content, what is the XY formula that this person is using, and they would just practice that blind iteration. They had notebooks separated between form and content, so it would be okay, this kind of ABBA type of sentence. Okay, so I see how this author who came before me used that. And they would just kind of practice that role. And then, with Shakespeare as well, his plot structure and stuff was quite, classic. There's nothing really totally inventive about it. But he was just playing around with, tried and tested, kind of anti-fragile ways of ordering material and then kind of filling in his own content. But because he'd done the grunt work initially of kind of learning how these kind of forms and mechanics that kind of take place just beneath the page work. So that was kind of one thing. And then the other thing is just the kind of, again, the blurriness of the border between fiction and nonfiction as well. And you kind of see these, especially in journalism, is kind of becoming more apparent now. These kind of snappy, catchy leads that are kind of like, they flash forward, they flash back, kind of like they loop back and around. There's kind of like, there's various structures of ways of opening a journalistic article. There's like a funnel, there's a bait, there's a hook. And like these are kind of like, nomenclature that kind of circle around journalism, but then they're exactly the same things that you see in a film or you see kind of a song catchy opening. So it's kind of the blurriness of the borders between all these different disciplines, which I think have been specialized and fractionated down to be kind of unable to speak to each other. It's that kind of Tower of Babel process. But I think, there's so much kind of inter-applicability between writing. So when you start taking more a holistic approach, it's like worlds open up.
I love the reference to the Tower of Babel. I have a theory that, for better or worse, the great book series that the Ivies would do here in the US, I'm sure Trinity did them as well. Those fell into disfavor, to put it mildly. But I wonder how much of that, I kind of believe that we collectively create ground state reality, right? By all of the sentient beings, we humans, what the majority of us believe at any given time in history tends to be the reality that we see. And one thing that I admired about the great book series, the familiarity. For example, I read all of Shakespeare. I read Will and Ariel Durant's entire 11 volumes.
I know. I'm still on volume 1. Yeah.
Yeah, but that created a lingua franca, right? A common tongue, where people who had done a similar course understood one another's references immediately, right? And my father was he was an English literature professor, and early in his career, he left that. Sadly, I think he would have been happier had he stayed in that profession. But the ability to immediately grasp a reference, right? You see some things on social media, for example, where you make an obvious reference like "Methink the lady doth protest too much," right? And where that's from, but a lot of people don't. What is there any way of bringing back? Is there any way of rebuilding the Tower of Babel so it's not the Tower of Babel, but rather it's the human colossus? I think there is, but I'd love your opinion on it.
Yeah, I think there is too. I think it's unfortunately that process of restoration is kind of downstream of culture, and as long as there's a lot of capital to be gained in tearing down, and I suppose we are in peak deconstruction is a kind of what it was called in the literary stuff. But yeah, I kind of get what you're saying. Like me doth protest, or you doth protest too much. There's a lot of people that probably just think you have a speech impediment when they hear you say that, or they see you write it down. But I think there is, and I think it does feel like growing pains, the way that, this kind of information flood that we find ourselves in. And I do think people are going to get sick of the incessant fractionating down of media so that, everybody's watching their own series. It seems almost to be like, there's very little crossover between, you could bounce 9 or 10 times back. Have you seen this? Have you seen this? And between two people, and none of them would have seen the same thing, even if watch Netflix or even the fractionation of platforms themselves, and like, the various subscriptions. If you can only afford one subscription, it's kind of like very difficult to kind of build that topos or common ground in between people. But I think people will kind of hunger for that, or it'll become cool again at some point. I'm just, these I wish I could fast forward some of these time horizons, but it's been always hard to predict.
But I kind of think there's an edge there. And I think that if there's an edge, it will get exploited. And by that, I mean, the old quote about if you really want to come up with something new and different, read a very old book.
Yes, sir.
Right. So I think that there are so many incredible stories, both fictional and nonfiction, that all you got to do is kind of like go back through history, go back through some of the greatest writers, and oh my God, like you have no excuse for not being able to come up with, I don't know, 10 different movies or 10 different new twists on a novel. In fact, we were chatting with Liberty and our friend Jimmy Stoney, who's written several books, and it was palpable, the feeling that we're at a juncture here where we can do all sorts of incredibly cool new things we were talking specifically about audiobooks, but with books in general. What are your thoughts about my idea of books as living things, as opposed to, the author sent the final manuscript to the publisher, it was published on paper, it was set in stone, so to speak. We now live in a digital world where that no longer has to be the case. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I think in the nonfiction world, definitely that's like a huge competitive advantage going forward. Because I almost think, especially with like the rate of change at the moment, that almost like writing a statistic in a book, you're almost kind of setting yourself up for failure, especially if you're going through the traditional, iceberg rate publication methods of lore. Just going through a traditional publisher, basically. I think everything that you write is going to be instantly out of date. Now there is kind of something. It lends itself then to perfectionism as well on the side of the author. I can imagine scenarios whereby you try and go back to your favorite line and find it gone, and things like that. And there's also kind of the case of Roald Dahl, where things are being kind of digitally edited retrospectively, kind of beyond one's control. But I think it's still definitely net positive, I think, because there's probably be a demand for both, stable forms, but then to have this kind of fluid option, I think is absolutely net positive. And I'm kind of doing that with Essayful too, where I'm kind of the reading list, I'm still adding to that, like the rhetorical forms post. I'm going to keep adding to that as I come across them. So it's kind of this liquid essay. I think it's in some ways, I think it's going to be a huge step forward. I think I remember I saw it on Twitter that this moving image on the wall, this moving newspaper from Harry Potter that kind of looked so mythical in the past is kind of slowly coming to life now. It could have been Robbie, actually. I think I saw on Twitter say that, but yeah, I think an absolutely net positive in some.
So I also think that with regard to your remark about going back and looking for your favorite quote and finding it gone, I think that there's room for both. By that I mean, maybe we found a unique use for the blockchain. We have the actual first version, that the author wrote unchanged and locked down. But then we have an obvious, and I think this is what's important, an obvious bifurcation, with, here's what the fan fiction did with this. Here's
that's interesting.
Here's what the publisher who has rights to muck about with the text of a beloved author did with it. Are you happy with that or sad about that? So I think that as long as it's transparent, that it can lead to really great things. I think if it's not transparent, then, I always put that photo up of Stalin and the guy he erased, right?
It's one of my favorite memes, yeah.
and so I don't think that's cool. I mean, if you start fucking around with Shakespeare, I'm going to be very unhappy. But I would love to be able to see an iterated Shakespeare, Shakespeare for the 20th or 21st century. And this idea of using it as a jumping off point, right? And paying homage to this brilliant man who, it's like the old joke: if it's not in Shakespeare, it's not worth thinking about.
Mm-hmm. But now everything can be in Shakespeare if you're not careful. So,
well, it's like funny, right? So we're watching the show Succession, and they had a big reveal last night. They killed the protagonist, Logan Roy, and I'm fascinated by it because I watched the show and I see King Lear, right? I mean, it just is a doppelganger. And this is, again, I wonder what would happen if we updated Lear, but made him a media mogul, a fictional Rupert Murdoch, for example. And I'm excited by things like this because it's a good show. And like people who might never be willing to read Lear are seeing Lear, on the TV screen. What are your thoughts about that? What do you think about it?
Yeah. It's cool. Again, it goes back to kind of what I was just thinking about and talking about earlier, but old form filled with new content. So again, it's like basically the plot of Lear, but then kind of updated and stylized and kind of, filled up with contemporary specifics and details. But it's like these classic arcs and classic stories like Icarus and stuff. You kind of see them; they're evergreen, kind of for a reason, I think. So I think, but with AI, there's going to be so much exploration and iterations of these things. And even as you said, fanfic, these kind of bifurcations of fanfic, and I think with the idea that the reader can also these kind of, I can't remember, it was on Netflix. It was kind of an immersive movie where you had optionality. You can kick buttons to go left or right.
That was Jabberwocky, Black Mirror.
Yes, something like that. Yeah, Black Mirror. It was Charlie Booker. So that kind of stuff in reading context as well, I think could be. There's never been a sense of agency with reading, and nothing comparable to online gaming and stuff like that. Which is, you could bring a generation back as well, in some capacity. But yeah.
Yeah, what do you think about that? What do you think? You bring up AI. I'm very pro open AI. I'm not a big fan of closed AI because I think that very few people controlling such a powerful technology leads to a panopticon, which is a very bad thing. Even though Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian philosopher whose corpse is still on display at the college in London, right?
I never knew that, actually.
Oh, yeah. He's stuffed, and he sits in a glass case. I think it's
ironic.
Very, right? But so Bentham came up with the idea of a panopticon as a kindness to prisoners in the UK, because at the time that he was envisioning it, like the conditions for prisoners were unspeakably bad. And yet what it evolved into was this kind of all-seeing eye. And that's not good for people. It's not good for society, in my opinion. But AI. So I'm a huge fan of iterating with AI, right? So ideas. I have a bunch of ideas about X, Y, and Z, and then I stick them into GPT-4 and say, give me some more ideas about this. And then I look at those. I think, I don't like this one. I don't like this one, but I do like this one. So I capture the ones I like, feed it back into the GPT, and iterate a list of. I just recently sent one around at OSV. I think you were copied on that.
I did, yeah, I saw that.
And I think that this sort of centaur, man plus AI, is going to be the model that ultimately wins. What do you think about AI and writing?
So I'm worried about the plus. So I think because it's human tendency towards slippery slopes of least resistance can kind of heavily lean on the centaur. Like when I think about memory, in an ideal world, we would have kind of used our computers to kind of store all the extra stuff, but also kind of kept our own memory muscles pumping as well. You see people. I see people older than me. It's something I don't really even have myself. Recite a poem from memory, and that's kind of like. But aside, yeah, exactly. Aside from rap lyrics and soccer players' names, I draw up a loss. You're a quote machine, and you were like necessity bred invention in that respect. So I'm kind of there's a worry that, for example, like things like Grammarly, as they get really really good, I think people just won't bother learning the rules of grammar in the first place. Kind of makes it difficult to, like Shakespeare did, kind of break them efficiently. And there's a famous meme of Picasso where he, at AD, he was kind of basically doing hyper realistic pictures, and then he just got mad once he'd mastered the actual rules themselves. Then he went mad because he knew how to break them in the most artistic ways possible. So it's like if people don't have these rules in their head in the first place, and it's all laid out in front of them, I wonder, is there going to be that engagement with the rules themselves, or will it kind of be entirely externalized, like I think some memory is becoming now, which kind of makes the creative process occurring within one's head. Like the nodes aren't there to connect internally. It's all laid out in front of you, which kind of dehumanizes the process a little bit. But on the other hand, if people are able to kind of grab hold of that plus and kind of keep the human and centaur kind of straddled in some way, then I think there's an extra kind of quantum leap that could be possible for those people who kind of have the mental fortitude to hold on to their sense of self while using the tools and not leaning on them.
So much to unpack there, because when I listen to you, I immediately think, well, that's going to give a tremendous edge to the people who do learn the rules, who do read the old, who do have the however unreliable memory. I can recite 100 poems from memory, and I did that just because my dad was into it, and I thought it was cool. Honestly, I just thought it was cool.
It is.
I still remember reciting the love song of Geoffrey Poofrock when we were my wife and I, newly married. We were in the Bahamas on an out island, Abaco, which at the time had horrible roads. Anyway, you would try to go from Treasure Key, where we were, to Marsh Harbor, and your car would inevitably break down with a flat tire or something. And so there was a cultural habit that if you saw somebody broke down, you'd pick them up. And so we saw a couple broken down and picked them up, and we got to talking, and turned out that the wife was a literary major, and so I recited the love song of Geoffrey Poofrock. Now, this is in the 80s. Even in the 80s, she looked at me and she goes, "You did that to get girls, didn't you?" And I was like, "You nailed me, but I got one." So, but the idea that an edge can be created, a big edge, I think, if you truly embrace the centaur model, and don't take the lazy way out. I think, yeah, the power laws rule everything around us, right? And so 80% probably will take the easy way out. And I think that will collapse into a sameness and a dullness and a, kind of like corporate speak, if you will, that is passive, unengaging, and undistinctive, unoriginal. And so I think that people are switched on enough to sort of intuitively say, ugh, that looks like it was just written by an AI. It'll probably become like a term of art, right? Yeah. Give me something that isn't written by an AI. What do you think?
Yeah, the AI speak, something of the kind. Yeah. And I think now, as you were saying that as well, I think I may have been romanticizing even my own and how many people actually learn the rules of grammar in the first place. I think that so there was a lot of bad. It's not as if writing was great and then this is going to like regress it lower. This may just like I think 80% of writing is probably terrible as it is, and it may just kind of slightly bump that to like an actually improved level. But then those who hold on to the sense of human plus AI, you would have just it'll be like a market jump in quality then as well. So it may just kind of further entrench divisions that already exist, but then raising both levels, but the human plus AI at even higher again. So it would be a net positive in both fronts.
Let's talk about rite of passage and why you, as one who have degrees, both a bachelor's and a master's in literature and writing. What drove you to say, "Ooh, rite of passage. I'm gonna give this a go"?
Yeah, well, I've been familiar with the Dave Perell and that kind of world of online writing that kind of didn't really exist either in like the highly corporatized kind of copywriting culture or in the highly affected academic online culture either. And so it's kind of this middle ground. And then I was kind of coming out at the end of my master's and I was kind of flirting with PhD tracks and things like that. So it caught my eye literally as I was turning my body leftwards into a PhD, I think. So I thought, you know what? Let me just kind of dip my toe in this world and see what's going on. Then things kind of snowballed from there. And again, it wasn't even the sense like I've been writing for years. I've been published in a few places. And my kind of university, all I do is write anyway. So it wasn't even the writing part of it that was useful to me, but it's kind of just the community. It sounds kind of cliche, but it was the community part of it. Literally talking about these things out loud, which wasn't something I was used to. Kind of coming from where I came from, and in university, just kind of not going and kind of do my own stuff. So it was a solo, silent mission from kind of day one. So then actually opening up and getting to first again we hear people kind of talk enthusiastically about writing without kind of like it being like derogatory in any sense. And then kind of speaking myself and things like that, and kind of just seeing genuine enthusiasm. There's a lot of kind of thinly veiled cynicism and stuff, especially kind of online. But kind of seeing raw enthusiasm or something is kind of unique. I think it's kind of cool to be kind of like ironically detached. Nowadays, I think it's kind of a nice safety mechanism from getting burned or getting owned in any kind of particular way. So yeah, that's kind of, and then from there, then it was a short skip and a jump to OSP.
And what did you take away? I love the idea of the shared enthusiasm, right? So I'm very bullish on that aspect of the internet as the greatest variance amplifier in human history, but it also allows people with similar interests to find one another and to share their enthusiasm, to sort of bring up the level of idea creation, etc., in a collaborative way that simply wasn't possible pre-internet. Certainly, we would have certainly never met unless I happened to be visiting Ireland and literally bumped into you.
Yeah.
Or I was in Amsterdam and wanted to take in one of the classes those are really low probability events. But the thing that I love about David's initiative, Rite of Passage, is this idea that he also encourages everyone to put yourself out there. And he encourages the idea that I agree with, which is writing has never been more important, in my opinion. Because we're still very text-based. Now, we're coming up with other technologies, right? And YouTube is incredible for lots of things. But this sort of idea, of the book that I'm always recommending and holding up, on flattening, which is the one.
How about Nick Sunas, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I love about this book is we are now at a kind of connecting point where words alone are not going to be just the only medium. Like words, visuals, memes, all of those types of things are going to blend together. Generative AI is going to be able to weave stories, words, images, etc., together, and I think it's going to probably create a cool new art form, at which he got a jump start on. And I wonder though, like, do you think that it's only going to be the people who have this kind of driving passion? Well, let me ask you this, like, were there people in your cohort at Rite of Passage that were there, just because like they realized they were horrible writers and they needed to up their game?
It didn't seem that pragmatic, I think, kind of in a good way. It kind of seemed that it was kind of a direction that they just wanted to turn. A lot of them for the first time, so they probably didn't rate themselves that highly at writing in the first place. But it didn't seem that kind of transactional in the way people were speaking. It was like a different state of mind. It seemed that they were pursuing. A lot of them kind of taking a sideways exit out of corporate life or things like that. They kind of saw writing as kind of a way of exploring themselves and their lives and their day-to-day in an entirely new way, kind of a new challenge, which I think lends itself to the enthusiasm. It sounds as if it's not approaching it basically how I approached college, which is just like, bare minimum, be strategic, and then get your piece of paper at the end. Like people kind of like were there for the minute to minute, to get us to kind of, it was kind of a self-improvement mission as opposed to I want to 10x my writing. The hack writing hack type of ethos wasn't present. Thanks to it.
Yeah. And it seems to me that that's what was lost in academia, right? The enthusiasm, the shared experience, all of that, because like academic writing, oh my God, it's like, it is beyond difficult to like, it almost seems to me that it is aggressively opaque and very, very, it almost dares you. We dare you to read this whole fucking essay, right? And that just seems so self-defeating to me. Why do you think that? Like, why do you think? And by the way, it's not just, as we said earlier, it's not just the literary arts. I mean, good Lord, the academic papers that I've read on my old field, quantitative investing, they're like unreadable. You think that there's what's going on there?
Well, I think there's two answers. There's kind of a conspiratorial answer, and then there's kind of a human nature answer. I think one of the reasons for that is, especially when the humanities side, I can't really speak to the mathematics side of this. It's just not my field. I've read them like when I had to, but I can't really tell the difference between like a great quantitative paper and a really, really bad one, as well as I can with a humanities one. But I think there's an inferiority complex with the humanities, which is kind of like, we're not a science. So to make up for that, we kind of have to make ourselves sound as scientific as possible. And that's kind of where you see the ization of long nouns, etc. And no personal pronouns, anything like that, to kind of try and make it seem a little more kind of official and a little more objective, even though it's not the least objective writing. Then I think there's a quite famous quote from John Searle, I think, where he was speaking to Foucault, who said, so he basically just used to write his essay, and then he said, I would just add 50% nonsense just to keep people guessing and to kind of add a sense of mystery. So I think there might be an element of that as well, which, it's harder to argue against you, and you kind of make yourself esoteric and a little bit vague, kind of like, it's kind of a safety mechanism for critique and counter argument. So I think there's probably multiple streams flowing into that unreadability. But yeah, it's definitely not good, whatever's happening.
And
change.
What's interesting about that is as you noted earlier about Picasso and Charlie Mingus, the jazz pioneer, said the same thing to his son about music. But his son was actually an artist, and he was asking his dad whether he could just go abstract immediately. And Mingus said, no, you got to learn how to paint a real apple first, and then you can go and explore other things. Same with Picasso, right? Like, if you look at Picasso's early paintings, he was a master. And then he went and explored very, very different ideas, and, sort of the classic bull painting that Steve Jobs used to use as an example of, you take the concrete and then you have the ability to abstract it. And he used Picasso's bull, right? Which the first one is the actual bull, and then it's just lines at the bottom. But we humans understand exactly that that is a bull. And I wonder I wonder if society and culture in which you grow up in either represses that, your idea of, I'm going to add 50% bollocks to look important, right? And versus the masters have always been kind of that way. They distill, right? They don't add. Generally they subtract. Even in writing, it's called killing your darlings, right?
Yeah.
And I've always found that in things that I've written, like, you make them better by taking away for the most part. And if your objective is clarity and trying to get people to understand what you're talking about, it seems to me that simple words are better than complex ones. Let's just take it back to society and culture in which you grow up, because I'm fascinated by the number of Irish writers and thinkers punching way above their weight in terms of population, right? So there's a great book about Ireland, the Island of Saints and Scholars. And why do you think there are so many? Like, James Joyce obviously springs to mind. He invented a completely new way of writing, and was broadly criticized for it, but he was an incredible genius. But you had a list of Irish writers, and like, it's amazing how why do you think?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it for the last few days, only because I just sprung to mind is kind of, they kept popping into my head as I was thinking, and I was kind of just doing some population math. It's bigger than like this per capita. It's like, it literally doesn't make sense. I think that the oral culture definitely has a lot to do with it. I think that's kind of why the short story craft in Ireland is particularly strong with people like Frank O'Connor and the like. And I think that was kind of a basis from which a lot of it built. I think they were kind of the Sean Whelan as a couple of those fellas. And I think then I think the weather has like a disproportionate effect. Only because now living in Spain, I think, people are kind of outside all the time, and it's kind of a social pub, a lot of chatting, a lot of kind of like, we'll do the work mañana, this type of thing. I think being kind of locked in remote places with the rain and the cold, and you kind of have nothing else to do but to kind of like, entertain yourselves. Obviously, all this took place pre-internet, pre-television, when you're kind of really out of options for how to pass your time. I think that was kind of a nuclear setting that kind of just set connections going. I think that has something to do with it. Alcohol probably didn't. It's hard to know whether it did more damage than good. I think I saw I think Tinker Thinking the other day had some study, or it was some kind of quote that higher alcohol is correlated at least with like higher literary output in populations or something of the sort. So I don't know, perhaps that stereotypes are there for a reason too. I don't know.
I love the weather angle because one instantly thinks of the Russians too, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Cold. Yeah. In gulags, often do things by memory, like with nothing else to do. Yeah. I think honestly, there's something to be said, and there's kind of there's kind of a lot of tragic parallels as well. That's oppression and repression and things like that. Because there's pain at the heart of that, which is kind of there's a strong correlation between the Russians and the Irish in that sense, particularly as well,
and also a defiant spirit of the greatest writers, like the history of Ireland and the UK and the UK's repeated attempts to dominate Ireland. Of course, it didn't start with the UK. Caesar tried to take over Ireland too. And what's fascinating is I love Irish history. And got an opportunity to like learn the history of the O'Shaughnessy family, right? And then actually visit the ruins of the castles in Galway. And there's a very brief pamphlet, but really instructive, called The White Sheeted Fort. And it's about the history of the O'Shaughnessy family. And one of the things that was really interesting was they were sort of warlords, very powerful warlords in Galway. And then the Brits came up with this clever idea of surrender and regrant nobility, where they would go to Ireland and say, listen, or surrender your Irish nobility and we will instantly regrant you British nobility, which is pretty clever, actually, if you think about it. But the Irish, being the Irish, especially the O'Shaughnessy's, they were very stubborn, and they're like, fuck off, you slimy bastard. And anyway, right during the reign of Charles I, they used to call whoever was the head of the clan the O'Shaughnessy or the O'Sullivan, right? Whoever was the leader of the clan was the O'Shaughnessy. Well, during the reign of Charles I, the O'Shaughnessy kind of was like, hey, I like that deal. And he did it. And he surrendered his Irish nobility and was regranted British nobility. Of course, if you know your history, Charles I got his head cut off by a fellow called Cromwell, who went over to Ireland and seized all of the O'Shaughnessy lands, not because they were Irish nobles, but because they were British nobles. And then it was literally, it's like Kafka's Metamorphoses. Powerful warlords in Galway, Irish nobility, surrendered and regrant, briefly become British nobles. Cromwell seizes all of the lands. Because of that, by the time of the restoration of Charles II, the O'Shaughnessy was another guy, and he was like, fuck off, we're not British nobles, we're Irish nobles. And then subsistence farming on boat to America. In many ways, though, like that, the diaspora for the Irish was like almost one of the best things that could have happened. Because if you look at the impact that the Irish have had as on the world, right? It was generally not in Ireland where those huge impacts were being made, but elsewhere. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there's something strange about the spread of Ireland, and there's a sense of having to get away and to look back on it properly, and you're kind of seeing that with Martin McDonagh as well. He gets a lot of slack, being a London-born man, but he kind of speaks about art in ways that I find highly authentic and so familiar with what he's talking about that he can afford to be ironic. But some people don't get the joke. But then again, Joyce, I think, wrote most of Ulysses in Paris, kind of gone out of the country again. And then, of course, you have all the Irish diaspora in America as well. But yeah, if they say anything, Irish would have taken over the world if it wasn't for whiskey. I think there's some kind of book with some title to that effect anyway. But yeah, it's remarkable. There's kind of a similarity then as well. I've seen a lot of parallels in saying we were talking about the tragic correlations between the Irish and the Russians. I've seen like loads of papers and books talking about the parallels between the Irish and the Jews as well on the comedy front, and kind of being this kind of persecuted minority that had to kind of find clever ways to fight back, and it kind of built up kind of subversive, coded common tongue that kind of like, developed. Because Irish, we put way above our weight in comedy as well, with comedians and comedic writing in general. Like, and as to the Jewish people as well in the States, it's got something crazy and disproportionate about that as well, which doesn't come from the weather. I don't think, perhaps it comes from the weather too, but I think it is that kind of having to be clever about kind of this, like, slang culture that kind of developed into, highly ironic and subtle comedy as well.
I love that comparison, and I have a good Jewish friend who we were out for kind of a rollicking night, and he was a bit in his cups when he looked at me and he said, Jim, I got a confession to make. And I went, what's that, Michael? And he said, I really thought I hated Christians until I met the Irish. and I looked at him and I went, Michael, the Irish are pagans. That's why you like us. But then we actually later got into a more serious conversation about the similarities between Jews and Irish people. And one of the things that we alighted on was this veneration for education and learning. And at the time, I don't know if this is true today, but when one looked at the Fortune 500, the two top slots of ethnicity occupied by the CEOs of these Fortune 500 companies were Irish Catholics and Jews. And my friend made the point that what two groups venerate education more? What do you think?
Yeah, the Jewish people are famous for that. Kind of almost like, and same with the Asian people as well, where it's like, education number one. I'm not sure whether in Ireland itself, education, well, or my locality, whether it's rated that highly in a general sense. But I think that's different for Irish diaspora, because obviously in a different country, you're on the back foot and you're going to have to forge new ground yourself. So there's kind of immigrant mentality plus Irishness may very well do that, which the Jewish had as well. But I don't know whether Irish on Irish soil, whether we're maybe things have changed in my generation. I'm not sure how.
That's a really interesting thought, actually, because, when the Irish came to America, like America was openly hostile to the Irish. There used to be signs in bars, no dogs or Irish allowed, etc.
Indentured servitude. Yeah.
Indentured servitude, the whole thing, right? And so what did the Irish go into in America? They went into power, right?
Okay.
So they went in Tammany Hall, the police department. They went and tried to grab, and actually succeeded quite well in taking over the levers of power. So police, politicians, which ultimately, of course, led to corporations, right? And that the number of Irish Catholic CEOs. I wonder, though, is there something unique about the idea where people are kind of forced out of their own country, as you say, like, yeah, the Irish elsewhere are really into education, but not so much here in Ireland. I hadn't even considered that. I think I have to think about that for a while, because I've always found, like, I love Ireland. I think it's one of the most beautiful countries in the world, but I love also just the Irish people. Like, when you go and the conversation is just like, it's incredible. When I took my kids there in the early aughts, we still refer to the fellow who was helping us with our rental car, because he was like a poet, a comedian, and all wrapped in one. And we still do the routine. even to this day. Like the car wasn't ready, obviously, right? And he would come out and he'd tell us a story that was incredibly entertaining about something else completely. And then he would come back to the car and he'd say, "We're getting it ready for you. 5 minutes tops." And of course, 2 hours later. But he kept us so incredibly entertained. And like, you don't see that in almost any, and I've traveled very extensively, right?
With that,
You don't see, he was a car guy. And yet here he was, like, incredibly entertaining. And that we found, and of course, I lived there when I was a kid for a summer. And like, and that was the Paleolithic era to someone like you. It was the 1960s. But we found exactly the same thing. So a nation of storytellers. Yeah.
yeah, I think there's kind of some like, accelerated evolution going on with regards to conversation. And it's kind of like, the whole fish doesn't know it's wet type thing when we're there. But then it's kind of like when, for example, lived in Paris for a year on Erasmus. And then we were I was there with one of my good friends who's also is from Belfast. All of a sudden, we're like, okay, we're kind of like, on our own here, frequency wise, with regard to conversation, even amongst like, people from English, but people from other English speaking countries, we were like, okay, like we have to like, kind of slow down, not even in speed, but in like, it's kind of a shorthand, which is, perhaps like other countries have that as well. But like there's a kind of a rapidity and a shorthand there, and kind of a storytelling thing, a kind of immediate resortment to humor and undercutting whenever possible that you do kind of miss as soon as you leave it. You kind of realize, oh, that's not here now. I kind of have to reset, kind of recalibrate to my surroundings now. But yeah, it's very unique. And yeah, I've been most places. I haven't been to America, but I've been most places English speaking, not English speaking. And it seems to be quite rare.
So why Spain? Why did you decide to move to Spain?
So kind of had a long love affair with Spain. But when I finished high school, I took a year out before university. Kind of didn't really know what I wanted to do per se. So I went I think I found out on a Wednesday, and then on the Saturday I just moved to Tarragona to work in kind of an educational English camp for, I think it was like 6 months or something like that. And then met a few people there. And then since then, I just have friends here, friends in Ireland. We kind of come back and forth. We did Canaries here. It's like now friends in Madrid. I went to their wedding. So I kind of built up roots. And it's kind of the only hot country that I visited so far that kind of approaches an Irish level of kind of joviality and kind of general fun and laughter, which I found is not as common in some cultures and countries as I'd prefer. And so yeah, it's kind of cheap, it's sunny, it's nice to work outside as opposed to be cooped up. So it ticks many boxes, I would also.
And language barriers?
Yeah, it kind of always starts rough because I kind of and lose it quick because it's all conversational. One of these, I kind of said, the last 2 years, I've said this is the year that I actually get fluent and sit down with a textbook and start burning through it. So I get enough to get around relatively quickly, but then whenever I kind of go again, it disappears pretty quick. So I'm in the rapid onset Spanish learning again now at the moment, just to kind of get around. Especially beyond, there's basically no English whatsoever, which is good.
Yeah,
there's no way out.
Total immersion, right?
Exactly.
So what's next? Essayful is amazing, and obviously we are sponsoring that with you. What's next for you?
Well, I suppose on the OSB front, I'm kind of just trying to jump into as many projects as I can. So the main one being Tinker Think, of course. So I'm really looking forward to getting. He sent out a tweet apologizing to me the other day that he just added 2 more, so it's 52 stories that he now has for White Mirror. So I've gone through. We have kind of had a shared Google Doc now, so we're kind of start going through them. just methodologically, story by story. Probably go through various levels, kind of go like a linguistic back and forth, narrative back and forth, character back and forth, and I could go on level by level, which is kind of not something that I had ever done before, but it's something that I've been reading about and wanting to dip my toe into for a very, very long time. So I can't wait. And for him, it's his first time kind of dealing with an external creative force as well, besides AI. So I'm the human plus that's entering the picture. So I think we're both kind of excited to get our teeth stuck into that.
Yeah. And obviously that's one of our big initiatives. And I just think that the collaboration and creativity that we're going to see over the next 10 years is going to be explosive. And so I'm super excited about it. Well, I think you know, if you've listened to any of my podcasts, I don't know. At the end, we always ask, we're gonna make you the emperor of the world, and you can't kill anyone, you can't incarcerate anyone, but we're going to give you a magic microphone, and you can say 2 things into it, and the entire population of the world, whenever their morning is, they're going to wake up the next morning and they're going to say, I think and fill in the 2 things that you're going to incept in them. What you got for me?
Read a chapter of something and write down what you think about it.
Like that. So you're using that as 1 or 2? Because I would accept that as a single command line and it'll give you another one.
Okay, I'll take another one and show it to somebody just to add that extra bit of pressure to it.
Magic. I love that. Read a chapter of something, write it down, and show it to somebody. Like, that would make the world a much, much better place, I think.
Yeah. I think everyone would be thinking in a way that they hadn't thought about in a long time.
I love it.
Slight sense of dread.
I love it. Well, Dylan, we're delighted to have you as a member of the team. Other than at OSV, where can our listeners and viewers find your stuff?
So Twitter is probably the best place. Delano E4. I kind of share everything through there. It's been kind of my hope. So
terrific.
I'll see you on the other side. Anyone listening.